is now represented, is now called upon. And
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate that. I oppose this piece of legislation. I associate myself with comments that have been made by my colleagues on this side of the aisle. But I also wanted to just, in the middle of the night last night, happened to read something by historian Victor Davis Hanson, which I think kind of reminds me of this debate that we've been having, both the previous debate and this one to some extent. And he asked some pretty poignant questions about equal treatment under the law. And so I thought I would share a few of those. If you nullify federal law and refuse to hand over a detained illegal alien to federal immigration agents, are you more or less likely to be prosecuted than someone who likewise deliberately seeks to nullify federal law by bulldozing on his property a nest of federally protected squirrels? Well, we know the answer to that. What tradition of Western jurisprudence allows violent criminals in America's largest cities to be released upon booking? What law states they are instantly free to commit more crimes without worry of incarceration or punishment, while those accused of illegally parading sit in jail for almost 2 years now without having a trial? As far as, and this is a quote, as far as that reprehensible buffoonish January 6th riot, compare the treatment accorded to those hundreds, many guilty of, quote, illegally parading or demonstrating in the Capitol, with some 14,000 who were arrested in 120 days of rioting, looting, arson, assault, and murder during the spring and summer riots of 2020. Did the FBI spend over a year tracking down the names of those known from videos who torched federal buildings, murdered those in the streets, sought to storm the White House grounds, and set up no-go zones in downtowns? And I will add to that, did they have the biggest manhunt in history to track down those more than 14,000 rioters that they could identify? To incite the January 6th riot was prosecuted as a crime, but Kamala Harris, who was soon to be a vice presidential candidate in the summer of 2020, could incite with impunity. Even more, she helped to raise bail for violent offenders during those riots instead of the summer-long protests shortly after the violent attempt to storm the White House grounds by those protesters in the summer of 2020. This is what she said, quote, "They're not going to stop. They're not going to stop, and this is a movement, I'm telling you. They're not going to stop, and everyone beware because they're not going to stop." That's that usual thing that she gets going on, that circular talk. But then she continued on. They're not going to stop before Election Day in November, and they're not going to stop after Election Day. Everyone should take note of that on both levels, that they're not going to let it up. Not going to let up. And they should not. And we should not. Close quote. So, what do those who had recently torched the historic St. John's Episcopal Church take away from Harris's adolescent greenlighting? After all, Harris essentially promised continued protests, which she knew had so often turned terribly violent and descended into death and destruction. Were her insurrectionary calls a crime, or at least worthy of a cell phone grab? Leg iron? Squad of FBI vehicles swarming her car? You want to know why people look at us today and they say, there's a two-tier justice system. There's probably not even 2 tiers, multiple tiers. This is kind of what you get. This is kind of what you get. So, having read that in the middle of the night, I thought, well, that's pretty good, but maybe it's just because I'm tired. Then I read it again this morning, then I read it again later. And I said, you know what? I should submit that into the record because it gets at the heart of what goes on in this committee and so much of Congress today. This dichotomous, this very divergent view of life. And I have a good friend on the other side, and we've worked on other issues together, Mr. Khanna, and I get his impassioned plea this morning. I thought it was impassioned and heartfelt. I trust his motivations clearly. But I also felt, as one who's been ostracized by people who ought to come, ought to discuss, ought to debate cogently, logically, I thought, you know what? I've watched too much of this over the last 7 years. I'll yield back.
The gentleman